Being here today. So the four presenters in this panel masterfully articulated not only the problem of the modern in Iranian art, as the title of the panel suggests, but also the problem of Iranianness in Iranian art, as well as the ways in which these so-called problems continue to inform and sometimes misinform artistic, curatorial, and marketing practices. Hengame, thank you very much for giving us a literature review of some of the debates and questions regarding the issue of Iranianness in Iranian art. Mariam, I was fascinated by the selection that was presented in your paper, and I'm wondering if the Iranian artists who are mostly of interest to Western institutions are the ones whose work carries traditional aspects of Persian art, such as being labor-intensive or extremely intricate. And I would love to have your reflection on that. And I would like to also thank Roshanak for giving a detailed account of one of these intricate and traditional arts by the modern Iranian artist Esai. Now, my concerns in this response, which is hopefully going to be only 10 minutes, is more in line with Tallinn Gregor's concerns. And this concern, which is shared by both of us, results from some of my recent interviews with many contemporary Iranian artists who are all currently residing in Iran. During those interviews, I noticed a common viewpoint. The majority of them would not want to be labeled as Iranian. In contrast to this opinion, I would like to suggest that there are some recurring themes that constantly surface Iranian art. In order to address this issue, I would like to take a fresh perspective by referring to what makes Iranian cinema Iranian cinema. In her essay, Abbas Kiarostami, Cinema of Uncertainty, Cinema of Delay, Laura Mulvey elaborates on a series of unique characteristics in Kiarostami's cinema that are also applicable to the work of other Iranian filmmakers. Unlike most of the existing literature, this essay does not limit Iranian cinema to cultural identity or socio-political events. In fact, more than anything else, the characteristics highlighted here by Mulvey are technical and artistic. Addressing the film Under the Olive Tree, which is, according to Kiarostami, just a film and not a portrayal of reality or a documentary, she writes, Kiarostami acknowledges the distance between a reality and its representation. Delay here is not only a fact, but also a factor in the film's aesthetic. There is a correlation between this aesthetic and the relationship between trauma and exegesis in psychoanalysis. Lacan's category of the real refers to the actuality of a traumatic event, personal or historical. The mind searches for words or images that might translate and convey that reality. But its translation into symbolic form and into consciousness separates the two, just as an account of a dream is separated from a time of dreaming and loses its original feeling. Faced with the reality of a tragedy, that is the earthquake in north of Tehran in 1991, the film tries to find ways of translating it. The protagonist would start to hesitate and find ways of responding to its surroundings, deriving images from whatever the camera observes rather than a narrative aspiration to order and organization. With the decline of action, an evacuated cinematic space fills the gap, registering the empty images of landscape or cityscape. To summarize, the cinema of uncertainty and the cinema of delay tends to work with the long tracking shots, which produce the loss of direction and a sense of distraction. It works with the delay that separates an event and its representation and its processes of translation. And while some of the motifs that surface these films, such as The presence of the road as a visual motif and the extended sequences of driving on it might be found in other cinematic styles, including Italian neorealism. They're nonetheless unique to Iranian cinema. To quote from Malvi again, in Kiarostami's cinema, an aesthetic of digression leads towards an aesthetic of reality, not in a simple opposition to fiction, but towards ways in which the cinema acknowledges the limitations of representation. Now allow me to apply some of these quintessentially Iranian characters to other forms of artistic production. Take, for example, Shirin Neshat's Rebellious Silence, where the notion of being Iranian is problematized. Neshat's portrait confuses the unfamiliar, non-Iranian viewer upon discovering that the text on protagonist's face is feminist poetry rather than verses from the Quran. Much like Kiarostami, Neshat acknowledges the distance between the reality of being Iranian and its representation in mainstream Western media. To borrow from Malvi again, uncertainty here is not just a fact, it is also an aesthetic factor. From Farooq Farrokhzad to Samira Makhmalbaf, Iranian directors have mastered a unique documentary style in film, wherein pure and innocent accounts can be also read as highly political. In documentary photography, too, the real and the innocent has a political edge to it. Take, for example, this photograph by the renowned photojournalist Abbas and its interpretation in his own words. Quote, "A fainting boy is carried above the heads of the crowd. The hats of the uniformed guards glistens in the rain as they push along the edges of the crowd. An eerie steam rises from the crowd. There is a rapture in this hegemonic picture narrative of the state as order gives way to chaos." This photograph is not just realism. It is a critique of realism. Since 1979, Iranian artists have criticized the very many problematic aspects of life under the Islamic Republic, but they have done so cautiously, quietly, and tentatively. A comparison with the works of artists Martha Rosler and Barbara Kruger, who are well known for their political arts, may be useful here. Unlike Rosler and Kruger, the Iranian artist either aestheticizes or mutes violence and conflict. Take, for example, the work of Bahman Qobadi, Parastu Foruhar, and Ghulam Hussein Nami, wherein notions of marginalization and suppression of the ethnic minority, torture and execution of political activists, and martyrdom of the youth have been turned into some kind of rebellious silence. There is indeed an element of deferred action, a Freudian term, in this artistic strategy, as though a traumatic event enables a return to a past which is now subject to reinterpretation. Appropriation is another technique that serves this subtle style of criticism of reality. Whether through criticizing the Puritan codes of Americana in the American Goths icon or condemning the atrocities committed by US soldiers in Iraq, American artists have turned art into a site of contested intents and meanings. A rather uncertain and vague and vague equivalent for these works is probably the work of Afshin Pir Hashemi, whose protagonists borrow poses and appropriate outfits from both the post-revolutionary Chaudhry icon and the supermodels featured in the Vogue magazine. In this sense, Iranian artists can also be seen as cautious culture jammers, who, like the situationists of the 1960s, reroute the ideological messages of post-revolutionary political billboards and posters to create new meanings. Although far less obvious than here in the US, where culture jammers rewrite the messages of advertisements and billboards, a new generation of Iranian culture jammers produces subtle criticisms of the regime's propaganda messages. This subtlety is all the more noticeable in Iranian feminist art. This art is shy and introverted in comparison to its Western counterparts. And like Kiarostami's cinema, this art is filled with missing moments, and I'm borrowing a term from Laura Mulvey, that lead to uncertainty. Allow me to compare some artworks that intend to communicate similar messages about domestic labor, women's bodies, as well as women's desire to speak their minds and hearts. Consider the interior scroll, which introduces the sexuality of the artist as a source of her creative and imaginative energy. Compare it then with this 2011 demonstration of women artists in central Tehran who congregated in Ferdowsi Square to commemorate a so-called celebrated lady in red from the late 1970s who presumably awaited her long-lost lover on the same spot. The public manifestation of women in love is a radical, bold move that has no precedent in the Islamic Republic, but this performance is a world apart from interior scroll. Even the notion of love is irrelevant here when considering that what these artists are trying to do is acknowledging the distance between reality and its representation. All of the aforementioned characteristics have counterparts in contemporary Western art, but like the Iranian moving image, Iranian art is always subtly different from its Western counterparts. And this subtlety is what makes Iranian art Iranian art. Indeed, like Iranian cinema, Iranian contemporary art may be thought of as one that is uncertain, ambiguous, delayed, shy, and open-ended. Thank you.